Hello everyone, and welcome to the video series for a flipped classroom version of Econ 366, Environmental and Natural Resource Economics. Over the course of this semester, I'm going to try to deliver as much of the direct instructional content via video as possible so that we can spend more of class time working on active learning. As you can see in this video, I am currently in my office here at Ohio Wesleyan. However, when we transition to the next slide, I'm going to go back in time to my pandemic cave where I recorded all of my lectures when I taught at Kalamazoo College in Michigan. Fortunately, most of the lectures for this class cover methods or techniques that don't change too much over time. So not as much has changed related to the content in these videos. It didn't make too much sense to re-record all 10 hours of them. Instead, you'll occasionally see me speaking from this room as a way to introduce video or cover a topic that I felt received insufficient attention when I recorded the original video. While this may throw you off from time to time, hopefully this is offset by the ability to watch these lectures in fast forward and rewind and pause when you need. So without any further ado, let's get going with our first video lecture of the semester on cost-benefit analysis. Cost-benefit analysis is really the root or the spine of environmental advocacy from the economic perspective. So to do this, we are going to first take a look at the history and criteria for decision-making in cost-benefit analysis, go over some of the key terminology, as well as the different steps that we would need to consider to make a cost-benefit analysis decision. We're going to then apply that to the problem of air pollution, before considering some of the kind of ethical, moral dilemmas that may arise in a cost-benefit analysis, and then also consider basically, I guess, two of the primary concerns, two of the primary problems with cost-benefit analysis, looking at both mortality and loss of life and morbidity or sickness, and how we value both of those as they relate to pollution. So cost-benefit analysis has been institutionalized in American government since 1981 with an executive order signed by Ronald Reagan. And this executive order required cost-benefit analysis for any federal funding project which was worth more than $100 million. And this was thought of as a way to limit government intervention into the environment, into markets, because the thought was by the Reagan administration and those supporting this that that we were being a little too frivolous with our environmental regulation, that we were putting the government's nose in areas where it didn't belong, such as with the Clean Air Act of 1970, which forbid any sort of cost-benefit analysis for regulating air pollution, that this was viewed as something that should be done regardless. Doesn't matter what benefits we're receiving from it or how we quantify those benefits, that this provides, the Clean Air Act regulation of air pollution would provide such great and really immeasurable benefits that we shouldn't try to quantify it for fear of the benefits not looking as great as the costs that we would impose on companies by mandating that they put on scrubbers or that they create less pollution, which would be costly for them. Now, this 1981 executive order then was a way to kind of recede on that environmental regulation and say, we can't make these decisions regardless of the cost and benefit, that if we're going to use taxpayer money and their minds to intervene in the environment and public life, that we at least need to make the case to the taxpayer that these benefits are going to be greater than the cost. And their thought was that it's the environment, we can't really calculate the benefits that well, so for the most part the government's going to be hands off and we're not going to be involved as much. Now, this has paradoxically led to more regulation, as the years since 1981 have really been the kind of cradle of environmental economics, and specifically of cost-benefit analysis and non-market valuation, using economics as a way to put a price and put a value on environmental goods and ecosystem services, which typically, there's no dollar value that's directly exchanged for them. And so over the past 40 years, environmental economics has really developed a variety of methods for placing dollar values on the environment. And for the most part, this has justified more government spending because the benefits provided by a clean and protected environment are so great, as calculated by economists. And so one particular example of this in the 1980s, so shortly after the passage of this executive order, was that lead in gasoline was already being phased out. So lead was added to gasoline as a way to reduce its combustibility, I guess would be the word for it, that it was too light before and the vapors would catch on fire, and there were all kinds of explosions in the early 1900s. And actually somebody from Western Pennsylvania ended up passing away in my hometown of Columbus, Ohio, ended up saying, if we add lead, if we make the gasoline heavier, then the vapors aren't going to catch on fire, they're not going to explode, and we're not going to have these random explosions of vehicles. And the problem with this, obviously, was more lead in the environment, which has manifestations for environmental consequences as well as human health consequences and delayed development of children. And so in the 1980s, they were in the process of phasing this out. However, with the cost-benefit analysis, they were able to prove that the benefits, or suggest, I guess, that the benefits of lead removal so greatly outweighed the cost that they said we should invest much more money in this and accelerate the date by which we require the full removal of lead from gasoline, and that's what they did. And just one quick side note, that same guy, and I'll pause this after the slide so I can look up his name and share it with you, who created leaded gasoline was also the same inventor that created greenhouse gases, basically, or that, not greenhouse gases, but polyfluorocarbons, which are eating holes in the ozone. So, this one person, we had to find one individual that really caused the most environmental damage. It may actually be this one guy who passed away in Ohio, whose name is Thomas Midgley Jr. And this is really cool. I mean, there's obviously a ton of downsides of the remote learning environment, but the fact that I can not know somebody's name off the top of my head going through a bit of a tangent, be able to pause it, come back, look it up, and share it with you all, I think is pretty neat. So yeah, Thomas Midgley Jr. From, I think, Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, invented the ethyl gasoline, which created lead in the environment, or added more lead in the environment, and Freon refrigerants and CFCs, which ate holes in the ozone. But we'll do a quick pause, go back to the point which we were discussing, which is some of the fundamental principles of cost-benefit analysis. So we're going to think of basically two types of situations, two circumstances, one where resources are unlimited and one where resources are limited. And so if resources are unlimited, if we have unlimited government funds to do whatever we want, we don't have any fears of inflation, then we should adopt a rule where all projects where the benefits are greater than the cost and the difference between the benefits and the cost is greater than zero should be adopted, and where the benefit cost ratio, where benefits divided by costs are greater than 1. Now, when resources are limited, then we have to weigh projects against other projects and adopt only those which are going to be the most efficient use of our resources, and adopt those which maximize net benefits. And so this may require discounting, which we'll talk about next week. And we can think of these two rules as implying two different sets of criteria. So when the benefits are greater than the costs, or the benefit cost ratio is greater than 1, these projects would be considered admissible. And when we consider projects which are going to maximize net benefits, they're going to maximize the difference between benefit and cost. These are going to be preferable. We can also distinguish and categorize cost-benefit analysis by thinking about cost-benefit analysis, which is done beforehand, which is done ex ante, and those cost-benefit analyses which are done afterwards are those which are ex post. Now, ex ante is typically what we want. We want to think if we deregulate, or if we deregulate and we allow a company to build a pipeline under a body of water, what are going to be the costs and benefits of doing so? And that is going to inform our decision making and determine whether or not we should allow the company to build the pipeline. However, this is much more challenging because we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know whether the pipeline is ever going to break. We really don't know, even if we know everything there is to know about the structural integrity of the material of the pipeline, we don't know how it's going to interact over years in the water, or whether there's going to be any geological seismic activity. And so it's, we're making an estimate. Ex post cost-benefit analysis afterwards, after the fact, is going to be easier, but it's also going to be of less value if the pipeline does break and we spill oil into the Kalamazoo area. Then we can say, look, this is really costly, but doesn't do us a whole lot of good after the fact. Now, as discussed in the previous slide, one of the key concepts in determining cost-benefit analysis, or applying cost-benefit analysis, is going to be that of efficiency. And we are going to classify allocations, or basically distributions of resources in society, as being efficient by whether or not they are Pareto or Kaldor-Hicks optimal. Now, these are going to be two completely new words, and we're not really going to get into the mathematics of these. For any of you considering graduate school in economics, you can make little boxes of these and prove optimal conditions. We're just going to be concerned with the terminology. Now, Pareto optimality is going to be the distribution in society where no other feasible allocation could benefit at least one person without making anyone else worse off. So we could have a Pareto improvement if we can create a new distribution which is going to improve the lives of some people in society without worsening the lives of anybody else. So this is basically like, finding wealth that didn't previously exist. Kaldor-Hicks efficiency is going to be a little bit easier to implement. We can see that, the problems with Pareto optimality by thinking about distributional concerns, that if we have a hypothetical society where there is all of the wealth accumulated in the hands of one person, let's call that person Jeff Bezos, and everybody else has nothing, then to make anybody in society better off, we would have to take money away from Jeff Bezos, unless we're going to create new wealth, which would go to the people. But if we take $1 away from Jeff Bezos, give it to somebody else who has nothing, we would typically think of that being a good thing. However, that is not a Pareto improvement, because we'd be making Jeff Bezos worse off. Now, Kaldor-Hicks is going to look at that and say, realistically, that's still a good thing, because the people who had nothing prior to the redistribution are definitely improved. And if they wanted to, they could, compensate Jeff Bezos for the loss of the dollar. They're not going to, but if they wanted to, they could. So that's going to be our two types of efficient solutions. And efficiency is only going to be determined not on distribution, as we discussed with the Pareto optimality Jeff Bezos example, but on the total amount of resources. Basically, getting back to that point from the first day of class, where we are maximizing the total happiness with just simple additive happiness from person to person. This is really, I think, a limit to our understanding, but it's the way that these calculations are made. Now, we discussed the distributional concerns. Cost effectiveness is going to be something slightly different. We're just going to think of this as representing the least cost means of meeting a target. So let's say that we have a policy we want to implement, which is going to have certain benefits. The cost-effective way of implementing that policy is going to be the least cost way of doing so. So these are terms that we'll probably use as we continue to discuss cost-benefit analysis. And for now, let's actually take a look at the different steps and terminology that we're going to need to consider how cost-benefit analysis should be implemented. And to do this, we're going to take an applied approach and think about the problem of air pollution. So when we're asking a question, for example, of how stringent environmental standards should be for air quality, we're going to weigh the costs and benefits of regulation and cleaner air. So first, let's take a look at how we would categorize the benefits of improved air quality. And we could think in this case, at least, of perhaps 4 different types of benefits of improved air quality. And we can think of human health, that air pollution is going to not only shorten our lives, and it does so significantly. We'll actually look at this a little bit later with regard specifically to India, but also causes illness, which is unpleasurable, and people would pay to avoid being sick. As we all know, over the course of the past year, you buy masks, you buy zinc probably. I don't know if anyone else is doing that or if that's just our family, but you take steps which are necessary to avoid being sick. You're obviously better off not being sick than being sick. So, just an intuition there. Improved air quality also has impacts visibility, which improves amenity values. Amenities are just going to be attributes or characteristics that either make us happy or unhappy if it's a disamenity. For example, if you live next to an airport and there's a bunch of jet plane noise, which is keeping you up at night, that is a disamenity from the airport. There are ecological effects, such as ecosystem services, that marshes, marshland in wetlands, typically don't have a whole lot of development value. They don't bring a lot of tax revenue to local governments, but they reduce the severity of tropical storms and the damages inland. So they do provide benefits. We also discussed this on the second day of class. And we think of agricultural benefits of cleaner air as well, that is going to impact crop production, and which is going to be profitable for farmers and bring more nutrition to the population. When we think of the costs of air pollution regulation, we typically only think of the economic cost to the firms, to the companies which are polluting, such as the cost to install the new technology. If they're putting a scrubber on their smokestack to capture some of the pollution that would otherwise be going into the air, if they are installing solar panels for electrification of the production process, and how that impacts the profitability of the company, or if they have to reduce their production, how that impacts the profitability of the company. And we could go on and on thinking about the different ways that environmental regulation impacts the firms themselves. But we also need to think about the flow of these costs throughout the production decisions and throughout the rest of the economy. So when the firm becomes less profitable, does the capitalist who owns the firm, do they just eat that cost, or do they then lay off workers who now are unable to provide for their family, or are living on government aid, which may increase taxes for people nowhere near this firm? Is there a reliability of access to the product, which is going to be impacted by this as well, especially if it's a product that is needed, if it's a mask in a pandemic.
is the cost of the product going to increase for the people who need to buy it? And that depends on the elasticity of the demand for that product. So really, it's short-sighted. It's how we typically think about these costs, but when we do a proper cost-benefit analysis, we want to think about all the costs of regulation as well as all of the benefits. Now, I'm about to set up the steps for cost-benefit analysis, and to do so, we're going to rely on a couple different terms here. So one is going to be the transfer coefficient, and this transfer coefficient is going to measure the constant amount that the concentration of the pollutants at a reception site, where we measure it, typically by where the people who it's going to impact live, how that measurement, how that concentration is going to rise or fall if the polluting source, if the firm, if the plant which is creating the pollution emits one more unit of pollution. So, for example, we may think that for every ton of sulfur dioxide that's emitted by a paper manufacturer, that only a half a ton is going to end up reaching the population which we are most concerned about. And so that transfer coefficient then would be 0.5. We also want to consider dose response functions. And these are, instead of transfer coefficients, which take a look at how does pollution at the point source translate to pollution at the population level, dose response functions are going to take a look at how pollution at the population level is going to impact health of that population. And so it's going to relate health effects to, in this case, air pollution concentrations and other factors affecting health. And so the slope of that dose response function measures the percent change in the health outcome for a 1 unit change in a pollutant, in this case, PM10. And this is going to stand for particulate. We're going to be using this acronym a lot. I believe it's particulate matter 10, and that 10 is going to be given in micrometers. And so this just represents the size of the air pollutant. And typically the smaller these are, the less likely they are to be filtered, and the more damage they can impose in our lungs if inhaled in greater quantities. And so we'll actually take a look at how different air particles compare in size on the next couple slides. But for example, using this PM10 pollutant, we can think that perhaps a 10 microgram reduction in PM10 reduces death by about 4% in studies of the impact of long-term exposure to air pollution on deaths. And so there we're taking a change in pollution concentration, and we are translating it to a health outcome. And that's going to be our dose response function. And that is going to differ from our damage function. The damage function is going to be taking the health outcome, being in this case, the number of cases of whatever health outcome we're considering, and multiplying it by the value of whatever that outcome is, if it's a case avoided or if it's a case imposed, if it's death or if it's a sickness. And so the value of that health outcome is going to reflect the willingness to pay of the population which is experiencing the health outcome or has experienced the health outcome. And we can calculate this in a variety of ways, as we'll discuss shortly. But one is using the human capital or cost of illness approach, which is going to focus on the lost productivity and the medical costs of that health outcome. So, for example, if somebody is, this it's cost-benefit analysis, and we're thinking about a public health crisis, so we may as well just use COVID. So if we're trying to value the loss of life due to COVID, then one way of valuing each death would be to think about what money was spent on the resources needed to keep that person alive, their funeral expenses, and the loss in their productivity, the loss in salary that they would then be giving up over the course of the rest of their life. This is typically a significantly lower bound on the willingness to pay, on the value of the case, for a variety of reasons. And hopefully that example makes it clear why we wouldn't just want to use that as a way to calculate the damage from COVID. That if we think of the number of cases of COVID and we multiplied it by that value of the cost of their treatment and loss in their productivity over the period of time which they can no longer work, there's obviously there's more value in being alive than just working and not going to the hospital. So we'll look at more sophisticated ways of doing this later in the class, but let's make it clear here, we're not valuing these lives to make any normative assessment about the worth of the people who experience any of these health outcomes. We're doing it as a way to represent the costs imposed by a pandemic, or the costs imposed by pollution, or the benefits of effective control of a pandemic, or the benefits of effective control of pollution. So when we now take a look at the 4 steps needed to calculate benefits in the cost-benefit analysis, we'll see some of those terms reappear in just different ways of phrasing them. So the first step in the cost-benefit analysis for environmental regulation, once again, in this case, we're thinking about air pollution regulation. We want to predict the change in the emissions of the pollutant associated with the air quality regulations. So if we are mandating that firms now have to implement they have to install scrubbers on their smokestacks, which should reduce their air pollution, we have to calculate or predict how much that air pollution is going to change at the point of emission. Then we need to take those changes in emissions into changes in ambient exposure. And this is going to require the use of our transfer coefficient. And once we know how the population is going to be, how their exposure to the pollutant is going to change, we can then use our dose response function to translate that change in exposure to pollution into a change in health outcomes. And once we know how the health outcomes change, how many fewer cases of particular type of disease, or however fewer deaths are created by that change in exposure to pollution, we can then multiply that number of health outcomes by the dollar value associated with that case, whether that is of illness or of death, and that's going to be our damage function. So next week, we will certainly go through some examples about how we could use all of these different types of formulas to calculate the benefits associated with environmental regulation. But for now, we can see how these different functions, these different calculations are used to compare the costs and benefits of air pollution regulation as associated with the Clean Air Act. So looking at air pollution, again, thinking about the costs of premature death, of the hospital admission for heart and lung disease, emergency room visits for heart and lung disease, the loss of productivity, and not only of the acute incidents of those outcomes, but also of the chronic exposure over the course of decades of air pollution. And so we need to calculate both the immediate and the long run effects of air pollution so that we can calculate what the benefits would be of remediating that air pollution. So as promised, this is the illustration of the size of different air contaminants. And so we can see where that PM10 classification falls, what particulates are larger than that, which are smaller. And so really we're looking at this point here. So pollen is not a PM10. Mold spores looks like are bigger as well, but clearly bacteria, viruses are significantly smaller. And whereas cement dust is not PM10, it's going to be larger. Fly ash from, I believe, coal plants, oil smoke, smog, tobacco smoke, soot, all of that is that finer grain air pollutant, which is going to be more difficult to filter out. And if ingested, if it's inhaled in greater quantities, can be just as, if not more, dangerous. And so when we're talking about PM10 or PM5, these are the types of particulates which we're discussing. So now that we know what some of these terms mean and the different steps needed for cost-benefit analysis, we can look at some of the information, some of the data collected for a cost-benefit analysis of the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments by taking a look at 20 years after the amendments were passed, what the reduction in health outcomes would look like. And so this would be a good time that I could just ask the class, what does this reduction represent? At which point somebody would raise their hand, I could call on them and they'd say, this is a dose response function. So I'm going to pretend that's what just happened, and we're going to continue on looking at this table and looking at basically the dose response, how health outcomes changed in response to a change in pollution. We can see that over the 20 years between 1990 and 2010, that there, for those aged 30 and over, there were 23,000 lives saved that otherwise would have prematurely passed away. That in addition to that decrease in mortality, there was a significant amount of chronic illness, which was minimized as well, such as chronic bronchitis or asthma. There were many more cases of hospitalization, which were reduced due to the Clean Air Act amendments, and millions of cases of minor illness, which were reduced. And so the question then is, since the Clean Air Act amendments were costly, since they imposed a cost to the government, which either then took away funds that could have gone into increasing educational outcomes in the country, reducing economic inequality, or creating a national healthcare system or something like that, other valuable pursuits that we may be interested in, we want to know that the Clean Air Act amendments were worth it. So how do we quantify all of these reductions in health outcomes so that we can compare the benefits of the Clean Air Act amendments to the significant costs? And that's where we need our damage function so that we can place a dollar value on the number of cases of death avoided, the number of cases of chronic bronchitis avoided, all the way down to even considering the non-health related outcomes such as visibility, agriculture productivity. And we can see that by 2010, the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 had benefits that greatly outweighed the costs. So the cost of the Clean Air Act amendments were between 20 and 30 billion dollars in 1990 US dollars. This 1990 is just indexing the US dollars so that we're not confusing inflation with the timing of when the deaths or cases were avoided. So we can see that the costs were between 20 and 30 billion 1990 US dollars, and the benefits from the reduction of premature death alone were over 100 billion US dollars. And that's not even considering the reduction in chronic bronchitis or other illnesses. And so by this metric, we can say unambiguously, yes, implementing the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 were clearly worth it, and were going to be beneficial to the rest of society. So as we could see in that figure in the previous slide, the primary benefits of the Clean Air Act amendment are coming from the reduction in mortality. And so what I'd like to do over the coming slides now is to discuss something that is controversial and feels, I think, viscerally like something that we shouldn't quantify, which is the value of a statistical life, or basically the value of a life lost or saved anonymously throughout a population, right? And so it's not thinking about, I'd pay everything I could possibly pay to keep my spouse, my child, my mother, my siblings, my father alive. It's not thinking about that. It's thinking about throughout society, when we think about losses in aggregate, how we can quantify those, not as a way, once again, of putting normative value on their lives, but because if we don't put any value on them, the value is reduced to zero by companies. And I don't want to vilify firms and companies here, because obviously they do a lot of good, but as we'll see in the next module after the first exam, they are external to the considerations of most firms, that profitably it's not in their best interest to incorporate the mortality effects of their production decisions unless the government or the population makes it their interest to do so. And so what we're going to be doing over the next couple of slides is trying to make sure that, or illustrating to you how we make sure that the value associated with a life isn't zero, and that we don't just ignore trade-offs, because when we ignore trade-offs, it doesn't make them go away. So typically this is going to be an interdisciplinary venture where epidemiologists will be involved with the dose response, and they'll calculate the number of deaths avoided due to reduction in air pollution. And then we can then treat these as equivalent to reducing the risk of death for each person in the exposed population, and then calculate the risk reduction per person. So if we have a population of 1 million people who is going to be facing lower levels of air pollution, and we reduce their risk of death by, we reduce the deaths in that population by 1 person, then the risk reduction per person is going to be 1 millionth. And we're going to then think about the value of a statistical life as being concerned with the probability of reducing a death by 1 person. So that's a little bit confusing, but hopefully these concepts will be more clear as we start to integrate. So to make this a little bit more clear, let's think of a case where we're going to be able to reduce the risk of death by 1 in 10,000. That's going to be our per person risk reduction. For each of 10,000 people, then that reduction of the risk of death for that population would save 1 statistical life. So once again, this is not a particular person. This is on average how many lives will be saved? And for this risk reduction for that population, the answer is 1. So that's a statistical life. Now, the value of a statistical life is going to be the value that we attach to the reduction in risk, which would save that one statistical life. For example, if each of those 10,000 people is willing to pay $500 for that per person risk reduction that saves one statistical life, then we multiply that population, 10,000, by 500, and that value that we associate with that one statistical life is going to be $5 million. So in other words, if we find the value of risk reduction was $500 for a 1 in 10,000 reduction in mortality, risk of mortality, it would take 10,000 such reductions valued at $500 a piece to save that one statistical life. So in other words, the value of a statistical life is going to be given by the change. So that triangle delta represents is just change in the willingness to pay for the risk reduction over the change in the risk reduction. So in this case, if that is $500 divided by, put this in parentheses, 1 over $10,000, that's just going to be 500 multiplied by 10,000, which should give us $5 million for the value of that one statistical life. Now that would be the case if that $500 is going to be the average throughout that population, which in the previous example was the same for everybody. Now here we could think of the source of that willingness to pay, which could be the premium that you may place on living in a safer area. So for example, if you're smarter than your environmental economics professor and you didn't buy a home on top of a plume of noxious carcinogenic chemicals, which are still leaking out of the West Kale landfill, then maybe you'd pay a premium for not living on top of carcinogenic chemicals in your groundwater. So that would be a willingness to pay. We may also, willingness to pay could also be what I've done after the fact, which is pay for reverse osmosis filter on our water so that it filters out contaminants such as PFAS and arsenic, so that I am reducing my risk of my family of illness, morbidity, and mortality, but I'm also paying for that by the cost of the reverse osmosis filter. So there are different ways that we can do this, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about non-market valuation. All right, so let's apply this to one last example for the time being. So let's suppose that there's a new environment policy which would reduce the average concentration of a toxic substance to which 1 million people are exposed. Further, suppose this reduction to exposure could reduce the risk of death from 1 out of 100,000 to 1 out of 150,000, and that each person is willing to pay $5 for this reduction in risk. So to calculate the value of statistical life, we're going to take that change in willingness to pay from 0 for no policy to $5 for the new policy, and we're going to divide that by the change in the exposure to the risk. And so prior to the new policy, there was a 1 in 100,000 chance in dying, and now is 1 in 150,000. So we're going to take the difference between those two, which is, let me get the pen out. To simplify this, it's 0.00000. Is that 5? It's 403. Repeating. So when we do that math, we get the value of statistical life in that situation is $1.5 million. Now, that doesn't tell us what the damage function is. That just tells us the value of statistical life. It doesn't tell us what the total benefit is of the reduction in risk. And that's where that 1 million people being exposed comes into play. Because as you can see, the population doesn't factor into the calculation of the value of statistical life, other than through our assumption that $5 is representing the average willingness to pay of those 1 million people. However, if we want to look at the total benefits, then we are going to need to multiply that $1.5 million, the value per case, 1.5 million, by the number of cases avoided. And so here we're going to have in brackets the 1 million people. And we know that the reduction in risk to those 1 million people is going to be this value. Oops. This 0.000003. And so when we do that math, this is another benefit of teaching remote classes. I can pause this to make that calculation. So it's going to be that $1.5 million multiplied by 3.33 deaths avoided, which would then give us a value of basically $5 million. So even for that relatively small willingness to pay on a per person basis, if that's the average for the whole society, and we are reducing the risk of death there by a sizable amount that's still, I guess, relatively sizable, but absolutely still pretty small. When it's multiplied over that large of a population, the benefits of environmental regulation really add up. And in this case, exceed or come close to $5 million. So like I said, we'll do more examples of this in week 2 as a class, but for now, hopefully you can see how one would engage in these sorts of problems. So the question then is, what are the standard measures for value of statistical life? What are the standard values, I guess, that economists use? So the most commonly used range for value of statistical life estimates is somewhere between $1 and $13 million in 2001 US dollars. So in today's currency, this would be more. And the US Environmental Protection Agency prefers to use an estimate that is around 7.4 million 2006 US dollars. So once again, north of $8 million now. And this means that for every life saved as a part of environmental regulation, we can attribute the benefits of that. We can add, $8 million to the benefit of that particular policy. Now, this is far from a perfect approach. On one hand, the average age of workers in the US is 40, which is older than the average age of a person whose life is extended by an environmental program. And the value of statistical life, somewhere in that range of $1 to $13 million, is going to vary based on how old the sample is. And how we calculate the value of statistical life is going to differ based on what methodology we're using. So, the value that we get is going to differ based on what methodology we're using. So, once again, we're going to have to pause this calculation issue a little bit for a couple of weeks until we discuss non-market valuation. But estimates of the value of statistical life created from averting behavior studies are going to be almost one order of magnitude lower than labor market hedonics. And just to give you a brief preview of what we're discussing there, averting behavior is what I was discussing with regard to installing a reverse osmosis filter, that I'm basically buying a product which is going to substitute away from risky consumption, whereas labor market hedonics are what is the premium that you would require to be paid to work in a industry with a higher chance of death. And so depending on which of those two methods we use to calculate the value of statistical life, we're going to get a different estimate in this range of that $1 to $13 million. And it's possible that it could be even higher. Now, in addition to the complications of calculating the value of statistical life are the inherent ethical dilemmas, moral dilemmas in using the value of statistical life and in calculating it, I guess. So we would first of all want to ask, is it ethical to value life even if we are assuming the people we are saving are anonymous? I say that it is, and this is my perspective as I try to make clear on the first day of class. We live in a pluralist world. If you can apply a universal set of ethics and morals to everyone in the world, you are going to become the most famous philosopher in the history of the human race. And until you do that, or somebody doesn't, really, it's really hard to say that one person's ethical code is better than someone else's. But in the way that I think about this problem and Justified is that if we don't put a value on human life, then certain actors are going to treat it as if it's zero, and that's the last thing that we want. So you could come up with a different answer to that based on your ethical code. I know that there are some who believe that the trolley example, for instance, is unethical because it places us in a dilemma where we have to partake in in violence and harm to others or something like that. So it's possible that you have an ethical code that prohibits this, but this is how economists think, this is how policies are made, and that's the goal of this class, is to make you conversable on that plane. Now, another ethical problem is that the value of statistical life is different in countries across the world based on how it's calculated. So meta-analysis, which is just an analysis of a series of studies, taking individual studies and estimates and combining them into one report. And so this meta-analysis of 953 estimates from over 68 labor markets in 14 countries found an income elasticity of the value of statistical life, meaning that if we changed income, how does the value of statistical life change? And we'll take a look at that coming up shortly. And there is the famous Ford Pinto case about how this could be abused as well. So we'll obviously consider that as well. So this is from the study that I was just discussing on the previous slide by Viscusi, and who's one of the most established economists, authors, scholars in this field. And in this table, the authors compare GNI per capita, so gross national income per person, basically what the average income is of the population of different countries, to the value of statistical life calculated for those countries. For example, in Austria, the national income per person, the average income, is over $47,000, and the value of statistical life then is over $8 million. However, if we look at the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where their average income is $400, it looks like, then the value of statistical life is It's not 7 million, it's not 700,000, it's 70,000. And that is just, absurdly low to think that we could place a value of human life to be less than, pretty close to what the average American household makes per year. But the point of looking at this table is you can see some of the ethical dilemma in using this framework and these calculations, and the conclusions that this could lead more unscrupulous companies to when they're thinking about the decision of where to locate a dirty production plant, right? So if they have the ability to offshore production of a good, something that they're producing, and they can either produce it in Andorra or Angola, for example, just two countries that sound alike, and in one country, and let's say that the pollution associated with the production of their goods is going to lead to the loss of one statistical life per year, then in Andorra, they would be creating a social loss of $7.4 million, and in Angola, they would be creating a social loss of $700,000. And the conclusion that company may then come to, completely outside of the cost of labor in these two countries, is we're going to be imposing less costs on society by producing our goods in Angola than in producing them in Andorra. And so this is how this methodology could be taken advantage of to impose unfair and unequal outcomes. And in this case, maybe it is better to have a value of life of 0, but that's kind of going backwards, and instead of aiming for a more equitable world where you would internalize those decisions into the production decisions, internalize these calculations or considerations into the production decisions of the company. But I just wanted to show you that as an example of how this may be abused. So as I said, I want to leave some of that discussion for next week, but to continue and basically finish our discussion of cost-benefit analysis, I want to look at a little bit more complicated of a case, which is that of morbidity, or just sickness, right? So mortality, I think, is a little bit easier to calculate the value of statistical life, but how do we calculate the value not of a life loss due to COVID, but to long-term chronic, I think what they call long COVID, or the long-term consequences of an illness. And so we can do this with measuring the private willingness to pay for a reduction in the risk of illness by reflecting the value of lost work time, so the foregone salary which you could have earned, which you're no longer able to earn by working, the value of your lost leisure time, that when you're laid up with a chronic illness, you're not playing ping pong or going out and going camping. That's completely lost time to you, and so there's that lost pleasure as well that deserves to have a value. The value of the expenditure to treat the illness, the value of the expenditure to avoid the illness in the first place, and that pain and suffering which companies like Ford placed $200,000 on. So when we add all those things up, there's a little bit more to consider. And so just as one example here, as a total amount of leisure time you lose goes up because of some pre-specified sickness, the more you are willing to pay to avoid that sickness. So we think there may not just be a linear relationship between willingness to pay and morbidity, but one that's increasing as well. So to value morbidity, we can ask directly for the willingness to pay to avoid the illness or the risk of illness. We can look at the rate of substitution of one risk for another, or we can use cost of illness estimates. And so we'll take a quick look at how these different approaches may differ and what some strengths and drawbacks of each approach may be. So the risk trade-off is going to be the process of valuing a sickness or avoidance of sickness by comparing the trade-offs that people make between the sickness that we're trying to value and another health outcome which we already have a value for. And so economists then observe how much people substitute away from one risky activity to another. And for example, we can look at saccharin in the 1970s, which is found in artificial sweeteners, and was found to be carcinogenic, so causes cancer. So the FDA tried to ban the substance, but was met with immediate public resistance. And the conclusion ended up becoming that people were willing to accept the additional mortality risk of cancer as a way to reduce the risk of obesity. And so we could value then the morbidity of cancer by the value that we already may have from the loss of life due to obesity-related health outcomes. So some of the costs and benefits associated with the risk trade-off are going to be that on the con side, some people may be willing to pay an infinite amount to avoid an increase in the risk of death. And while we may think that normatively this is perfectly acceptable, in a world with limited resources where we're trying to value the trade-off in different policies, which we don't have the means of implementing all at once, it's not going to be informative for policy decisions. We may also be concerned that new risks may be even more hazardous than old risks, and that by people making decisions based on the risk that they don't know, that they may be improperly valuing that risk once again because there's not a value on it because they don't know what the outcome is going to be. However, there are certainly benefits to this approach as well, and really it's computationally going to be easier for us because we don't have to know, we don't have to calculate the value for all different types of diseases or health outcomes. We just need a common denominator, basically. And oftentimes that common denominator may just be death, maybe the value of statistical life. And as we observe the trade-offs that individuals make between different types of health outcomes and health outcomes which are likely to lead to death, then we can start placing a value on those trade-offs. And so, whereas if we were to just directly ask someone, what value do you place on avoiding an illness, that's going to be susceptible to some of the same drawbacks of the risk trade-off approach, such as the hypothetical bias of them saying that they would place an infinite value on reducing the risk of death, but then not only are we not able to really use that value for informative policy making, but we don't have this additional benefit of being able to compare their trade-off to something else that we do know, because they're not making a trade-off, they're just telling us what they would do. So we've discussed the risk trade-off approach, basically discussed just asking people how much are you willing to pay to avoid being sick. And I want to save that really till we discuss non-market valuation, because that is going to be a significant non-market valuation technique. So really the last one here is just that cost of illness approach. And so the cost of illness is going to be just calculating the change in the explicit market costs resulting from the change in the health outcome, such as the medical costs of being in the hospital or of treating a chronic illness, and the loss of wages. So this is, once again, what we discussed much earlier in the lecture as being an underestimate of real willingness to pay, willingness to accept. So once again, we said it's considered a lower bound on willingness to pay, maybe even by a order of magnitude. And there's no real theoretical back and forth. It's not really economic, it's more accounting. And I think that's where, for any of you who have had me in intermediate microeconomic theory, I try to make that difference pretty clear between economics and accounting. Accounting is going to be just doing this cost of illness approach where you add up all the costs that we observe. Economics is looking for hidden costs and opportunity costs based on individual behavior in the face of scarcity. And so when we ignore those hidden costs, we may be underestimating the real damage of a particular environmental pollutant or health outcome. And so that's really going to be an area where economic awareness and understanding can help us make a stronger case for environmental advocacy and protection. Now, some of the advantages of this accounting approach, of this cost of illness approach, are going to be that's cheaper than most other approaches because it's easier to figure out the number of work hours lost, multiply that by a wage, do what we call a back of the envelope. So back of the envelope calculation. And that's easy to explain this to policymakers and to the public. So then we kind of have a trade-off there between ease of use and the accuracy of what we're calculating. All right, so that wraps up our discussion of cost-benefit analysis for this week. We are going to continue to build on the lessons in this lecture, both with a discussion in the coming week as well as some practice problems. And in the future, we are going to take a look at the methods used to create the input values into the cost-benefit analysis, specifically the non-market valuation techniques, as a way of valuing the environment to input into a cost-benefit analysis, as well as think about how we can incorporate time into our cost-benefit analysis, that if the costs are incurred in 1 year, but the benefits occur over years in the future, how do we make that consideration? So this is the foundation. We're going to continue to build on it. Thanks for your attention today, and I'll let you out of class 3 minutes early. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Otherwise, I will see you on Monday. Take care.